Natural moral law is a deontological approach to ethics. The term deontological comes from a Greek word deon, meaning duty. And so it starts from the view that actions are either in their nature good or bad. From this perspective, the consequences of an action are seen to be irrelevant. And so a deontological approach to ethics does not take into consideration what the consequences would be when making moral decisions about what is right and wrong. So natural moral law, which is the example of deontological ethics that we're studying, is most associated with the famous Christian philosopher called St. Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas' natural moral law fits in with some of his wider work where he talks about there being 4 levels of law. So you don't necessarily need to remember all of this, but it just helps us to see natural moral law in context. So firstly, Aquinas believed that there exists what he termed eternal law. So this is the law that represents how God created and controls the universe. So it includes things like the laws of gravity, the laws of motion, so the kind of things that allow our universe to function as it does. Aquinas believed that they had been set in place by God, and so he thought of those as eternal laws because they're unchanging and set in place by God. Secondly, Aquinas identified divine law. So he saw this as the revealed will of God, which can be found in the Bible. So in the Bible, there are loads of different rules, but the most famous example is the 10 Commandments. And obviously in those, God sets out to human beings how they should behave. Aquinas then saw natural moral law as the 3rd level of law. He argued that these are moral laws that are set out within creation, so they're natural, and they're part of just like human creation. He actually wrote that they've been written on our heart, and so believed that if we use reason, we can work out what the rules or the laws of natural moral law really are. Aquinas then also believed that there is human law. Of course, there's human law, and he recognised these are laws of the land that are created by humans and to help us try and form a functioning society. So when he was developing natural moral law, Aquinas actually was inspired a lot by some of the ideas of the ancient Greek philosopher called Aristotle. Now, in his work, Aristotle had explained that every living thing has an ergon, or a function. And he explained that, in his view, the ergon, or the function of a human being, is the ability to use reasoning. So what he meant by reasoning is the ability to think things through really carefully. So Aquinas was inspired by this. He believed this all those hundreds of years later. And he said that the ability to use reason is actually what makes humans different from the other parts of God's creation, such as animals. So to be clear, Aquinas took a non-religious idea that Aristotle had had about everything having an ergon, or a function, and he applied that to his own view about God existing, and he said that what God has planned in terms of function is for humans to be able to use reasoning and to be able to think deeply. And Aquinas believed that's one of the things that makes humans different from the other things God had created, like animals and plants. So also, as part of his Christian belief, Aquinas believed that God had given humans free will. That's a really important idea in Christianity, okay? The idea that humans are free and we're able to make our own decisions. And so Aquinas thought and taught that our function is to use reason and then to guide our free will towards doing good and avoiding evil. And that's really the foundation of what we call natural moral law, to use reason to guide our free will towards doing good and avoiding evil. So Aquinas actually came up with something that sounds quite complicated. It's known as the synderesis rule, but it's actually a really simple idea. And it is, again, like the foundation of natural moral law. So Aquinas wrote, This, therefore, is the principle of law. Good must be done and evil avoided. So this is like the starting point, really, for natural moral law, the idea of doing good and avoiding evil. Now, Aquinas, to give a bit of background, thought this was important because as a Christian, he believed in the fall of Adam and Eve. And he believed that the fall of Adam and Eve, when they ate the forbidden fruit, that it caused evil to come into the world. And it caused a breakdown in the relationship between God and people. And so Aquinas believed overall that humans have a duty to try and repair this relationship, and they can do that by doing good and avoiding evil. And natural moral law is his attempt to explain how we can do good and avoid evil. So, as we said, Aquinas believed and taught that if we use reason, then we are fulfilling our function. And he believed using reason can help us to work out what naturally is the right way to behave. So again, that use of the word natural there suggests why this is called natural moral law. So Aquinas believed that using reason, so thinking deeply about why we're here and like the function of the human civilization, will help us to work out 5 primary precepts, or 5 basic kind of laws or principles. And he talked about the fact that some of these are shared with all of creation, some of them are shared with only animals, and some of them are specific and unique to humans. But essentially, this is what the 5 precepts are, the 5 primary precepts. So firstly, to preserve and sustain life. Secondly, to reproduce. Thirdly, to teach and educate offspring. Fourthly, maintain an ordered society. And fifthly, to worship God. Now, Aquinas stated the natural law is altogether unchangeable in its first principles. What he seems to have been saying here is that these 5 primary precepts are unchangeable. Like, they can't be changed. Okay, they're fixed and they're absolute. Okay, they're universal. Okay, they're unchangeable. And from this, many people have said this is why the theory of natural moral law is seen as deontological, okay, because it's absolute and there are set duties here, okay, to preserve and sustain life, to reproduce, to teach and educate offspring, to maintain an ordered society, and to worship God. Okay, so as I said, it's really clear here in Aquinas' writing that these 5 primary precepts are unchangeable. So they're absolute, they're clear, there's no flexibility here at all. And Aquinas believed we can work these out if we use reason. So the next step in natural moral law is the development of secondary precepts. So Aquinas taught that secondary precepts, which are practical rules for living, can be worked out from the primary precepts. And we can do that if we, again, use reason and also apply what he referred to as practical wisdom. So again, to go back, what this would mean is that from the primary precept, reproduce, okay, so Aquinas is saying it's the right thing to do to reproduce. You can then develop secondary precepts that help make that happen, okay? So to help make reproduction happen, a secondary precept could be that it's wrong to use contraception. Because if you're using contraception, you're stopping reproduction from happening. Okay? To give another example, the primary precept, preserve and sustain life, a secondary precept that can make that happen is if we say it's not okay to kill people. Okay? Because if we're trying to preserve and sustain life, then that would mean that killing people has to be wrong. So a secondary precept could be that it's wrong to kill people. So these secondary precepts, according to Aquinas, can be positive rules. So it can be do this or do that. So to maintain an ordered society, do this, do that. Or they can be negative rules. So to maintain an ordered society, don't do this, don't do that. And an example we have here is that the secondary precept to not have an abortion can be worked out from the primary precept, preserve and sustain life, if we use reason. Now, natural moral law is usually seen as a deontological, absolutist approach to ethics because Aquinas clearly taught that those primary precepts, those 5 primary precepts, are duties that can't be changed. Okay, and if we go back, we see that there, don't we? The natural law is altogether unchangeable in its first principles. He also said, natural law is the same for all men. There is a single standard of truth and right for everyone, which is known by everyone. However, because the secondary precepts are worked out using human reason, it is possible that they could be wrong and they could potentially change. So Aquinas wrote, in its secondary principles, which, as we have seen, are certain detailed proximate conclusions drawn from the first principles, it may be changed through some special causes hindering the observance of such precepts. So originally, in the writing of St. Thomas Aquinas, it seems to have been that there could have been some flexibility and some changes in secondary precepts as a recognition that, human reason can be mistaken, knowledge and understanding can change over time, and so there maybe needed to be some changes. Now that's interesting because, as we'll see in a minute, in the Catholic Church, the secondary precepts are usually seen as being very absolute. So secondary precepts have become what we would call canon laws in the Catholic Church, so official teachings around behaviour and morality. So we're just going to talk now about a distinction between real and apparent goods, which is kind of an additional element to natural moral law. So if Aquinas is right in saying that we can all work out the primary precepts using reason, why do people do bad things? Why do people sin, essentially, to use the language of Christianity? Well, Aquinas gave the answer that what happens is that people sometimes pursue apparent goods rather than real goods. And he argued that we can use reasoning and think we're coming up with a real good that's consistent with the primary precepts, but we could be mistaken in that. So what Aquinas suggested is that a real good is one that's consistent with the primary precepts and also consistent with the divine laws in the Bible. So in other words, what this means is if somebody is working out secondary precepts from the primary precepts using reasoning, what they should be doing is cross-referencing those back against the laws in the Bible to make sure that they're consistent and they lead to real goods rather than just being apparent goods. So things that seem to be good but maybe aren't really. Another side note is that Aquinas also argued that the exterior action, what's observable by others, is not the only thing that counts when you're trying to act morally. So as a Christian, Aquinas believed that we will be held accountable at the end of our life to God for everything that we do, and also for our thoughts and our motives and the kind of reasoning that's behind our actions. So let's take a look at an example of this, okay? So the primary precept, preserve life, might mean that somebody thinks it's really important to give money to cancer research, okay? It could be a rational secondary precept, okay? A secondary precept to make the primary precept happen, preserve life, means that you give money to charities that are trying to preserve life. However, Aquinas would state that it's only a really good thing to give money to these charities if the motivation for the action is good. Okay, if you give money to charity so that you can tell everybody that you've given money to charity, so that you can get lots of accolades for that, then that is not a positive action really. okay? Because on the exterior, it looks like it's a good action, but in someone's heart, as an interior action, it's actually not great, because the motivation for the action is to get personal gain rather than because genuinely helping others and preserving life is the goal. So, following Aquinas' natural moral law about those primary precepts has led to the Catholic Church having lots of rules and laws about moral behaviour, so about ethics, that Catholics are expected to follow. So what happened was that the Catholic Church took the primary precepts and then worked out secondary precepts from those that are also consistent with the divine laws of the Bible, and they made those into laws. Okay, so under these laws, which are known as canon laws, actions such as abortion are seen as always absolutely wrong. Okay, so basically the Catholic Church has looked at the primary precept, preserve life, and they've stated that a secondary precept that relates to that should be that abortion is wrong. And so they've made that secondary precept into an official law of the church. Okay, so what it means in like real life is if somebody is a Catholic and they have an abortion, then that is seen as being absolutely wrong. It's going against the laws of the church, which are mapped back against those primary precepts. And so somebody who has an abortion is basically excommunicated from the church, as it says there, which means that they're no longer welcome, they're no longer a member of the church. So the Catholic Church supports natural moral law essentially because the overall concept behind it is the idea that God is the creator of all things and everything has a design and a purpose. And so we need to always be working towards achieving those primary precepts. So here's an example of a 10-mark question that you could get on this topic. So you could be asked to examine the approach to moral decision-making taken by Aquinas' natural moral law. So the key word here is examine. Now, in A-level religious studies, examine sort of means that you explain in really detailed ways what the focus of the question is. So the way that I always think about it is as if you're examining like under a microscope. You know, if you're examining under a microscope, you're looking at the fine details, aren't you, of whatever you're looking at. And that's sort of what they want you to do in a 10 marker. So how this is assessed is basically by looking at the level of detail, the level of specifics that you're able to include. Okay, so the question is asking you to look in detail at the approach to moral decision making taken by Aquinas' natural moral law. So your starting point here needs to be the approach, which is that it's a deontological approach to ethics. Okay, so in your answer, you would need to be talking about the fact that it's deontological and what that means. So it's absolute, it results in duties, and then explaining how that is kind of developed through the theory. So how the primary precepts connect back to the idea of it being a deontological approach, for example. Okay, so in a 10 marker also, the goal is to try and write around 3 paragraphs. So as a ballpark figure, we're aiming for around 400 to 450 words. And we should try and condense that into 3 paragraphs because that will help us meet the criteria for both breadth and depth. So obviously there are also some strengths and weaknesses of natural moral law as an approach to moral decision making, and so you need to have a think about that too.